Hello everyone. Let me ask you something. What does it mean to improve? You probably have some ideas about this, but let's suppose you actually manage to achieve all of the things that you're thinking about. What does it mean to improve now that you've done all those things? Again, you might have some ideas, but imagine you manage these too. What does it mean to improve now? As we keep going forward, it gets harder and harder to imagine what it means to get better. Eventually, at some point, the improvements we're thinking of are just totally beyond what we originally thought would make us better. This is probably something like the situation which the developers of the Zelda series found themselves in after finishing Skyward Sword in 2011. Although 2013's A Link Between Worlds did a lot of work to modify the Zelda formula, it did so in a two-dimensional play space. Today I want to talk about Breath of the Wild and how it tries to improve Zelda's three-dimensional design. After over a decade and a half of refinements since Ocarina of Time, improvement needed to happen on a trajectory that was both new and familiar to the Zelda series. Welcome to the first episode of Keeping It Sharp. Today's episode, The Silent Princess, how Breath of the Wild's story relates to its creative vision. Before Breath of the Wild came out, its developers, like Miyamoto and Onuma, would reference two principles which guided their design of the game. The first principle came from the realization that Zelda had become a formulaic and predictable kind of experience. Every 3D Zelda game between Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword feels like a different version of the same general gameplay experience. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but since Zelda's identity needed to be revitalized to avoid stagnation, the new Zelda would have to drop a lot of the core design, philosophy, and principles that had guided the series since the N64. The second principle came from a deep appreciation of the very first Zelda game on NES. Breath of the Wild's goal was to try to recreate, or translate, the sense of wonder and exploration found in Zelda 1. Rather than making use of top-down 2D adventure game design, it would now be using techniques and sensibilities of the open-world genre, developed and improved upon since GTA 3. A lot of PR and marketing tries to pull a fast one on consumers by saying that a franchise is looking to go back to its roots. But a look at what we got with Breath of the Wild's eventual release shows that the development team was committed to the creative vision of Zelda 1. Unfortunately, though, old habits die hard. The first principle, that Zelda needed to abandon most of the formula that had defined it for almost 20 years since Ocarina, was not implemented as successfully as the second one. In this essay, I'd like to take a short look at how Breath of the Wild measures up to these two guiding principles. If we look at its initial premise and traversal design, I think we see that it was successful in translating the wonder of Zelda 1's 2D top-down gameplay into a 3D open world. However, when we look at how a player's experience unfolds during the main quest, I believe that Breath of the Wild's commitment to leaving Ocarina's influence behind falters. By structuring the game's narrative and the progression of its main quest too similarly to the style of previous 3D Zelda games, Breath of the Wild undoes its own hard work in trying to give closure to its initial premise of a post-apocalyptic Hyrule. I'll start by describing what I believe to be the game's fundamental creative vision, and how it succeeds not only in adhering to that vision, but more masterfully in putting the player in the right state to appreciate that vision. I'll then take a look at how the narrative plays out in the course of completing the game's main quest, and make a case for how it undermines the emotional stakes that most of the game tries to set up. If it wasn't obvious, spoilers abound. The easiest place to start is by looking at how the game starts. As many may know, Breath of the Wild starts the player off in the isolated plateau. Of course, in terms of design, this functions as a tutorial for the game's wide variety of systems and general gameplay loop. But to evaluate how good Breath of the Wild is at following its creative vision, we have to look at the game from the point of view of the player, and not the game makers. I want to focus on Breath of the Wild's ordinary gameplay loop, so I think it's best to skip over the isolated plateau and focus on the context in which the player spends most of their time playing Breath of the Wild. With the isolated plateau, this means we shouldn't look at how good of a representation it is of the rest of the game. Instead, we should pay attention to how it feels once we've completed it, and how this feeling sets up our exploration of Hyrule that comes afterwards. It's worth pointing out that by the time you finish the tutorial, you've become acquainted with the game's environmental design, its story structure, and its mechanics. This acquaintance is just enough. You don't have a clear idea of what's going on, but it's not a complete mystery either. So, when the game world opens up with the paraglider, you feel motivated and prepared enough to be intrigued by far-off places without having a specific idea of what you'll encounter when you get there. Let's look at each element individually to get a feel for how they create the coherent whole of what it's like to play Breath of the Wild. The aesthetic design of the environment goes a long way here. I'm no artist, but playing through the isolated plateau and most other places in Hyrule immediately gives me the feeling that this world has been taken over by nature, but that things used to exist here not too long ago. There's a sweet spot being hit here. It's not just pure wilderness, but there's often enough space between points of interest, like ruins or a shrine, that it doesn't feel like you're tripping over relics of the past left and right. Animals and vegetation go a long way to making the wilderness feel mildly interesting to travel through, which makes sense since they're ultimately just transitions towards the next point of interest. When you do encounter ruins, though, they're in just the right state of disrepair. They're not so broken that you can't recognize what they used to be, but they're broken enough that they clearly can't perform their function anymore. The Temple of Time is a great example of this. To get to it, you have to cross a bunch of rocky formations and maybe a ravine, and once you do get to it, it looks very obviously like a temple, but the roof is caved in, so it's not quite a temple anymore. It's a ruined Temple of Time. Basically, Breath of the Wild consistently provides the player with a coherent understanding of what its environment feels like to look at. The result of this design is that whenever the player sees something interesting in the distance, they almost always feel like they're looking at something which is hiding what it used to be. The Temple of Time isn't a temple anymore, and it doesn't look like a proper temple up close, but from far away, it's intriguing. Looking at things in Breath of the Wild's world makes you curious about what they are. This motivates traveling to get closer, and this is the meat and potatoes of Breath of the Wild's overworld gameplay. Breath of the Wild's story complements this environmental design. As I mentioned, the game is fundamentally post-apocalyptic in tone, but it also features a mute main character with amnesia. Like in most other Zelda games, Link is meant to be more of an avatar than a character. We start by waking up at the Shrine of Resurrection with nothing but a mysterious voice and beautiful wilderness to greet us. Although we know that the voice is probably Zelda, this setup lets us focus on the world as our only source of information. Link doesn't get in the way, Zelda doesn't get in the way, it's just the player and this mysterious-looking world. Once we complete the shrines in the isolated plateau, the old man reveals himself as the King of Hyrule. After this, Breath of the Wild goes into a cutscene which functions as an exposition dump, a tradition Zelda has been following since A Link to the Past. Although you'd think that this would break the immersion created by exploring the tutorial area, the result is far more intriguing for the player. In this cutscene, the king tells us about the world and outlines the main quest. First, the king tells us that a great calamity destroyed everything lo a century ago. Then he apologizes for deceiving us in pretending to be the old man. After this, he goes into the very vague legend of how Calamity Ganon was sealed away 10,000 years ago. And finally, he describes the events of the Calamity 100 years ago, leading up to our awakening in the Shrine of Resurrection. After all of this description, the king tells us that Zelda is holding Ganon back on her own, and that Link needs to find the 4 divine beasts to confront and seal Ganon away once again. He advises us to go see Impa in Kakariko Village, before finally giving us the paraglider and disappearing. What matters here is not so much the specifics of what the king says, but how the cutscene doubles down on the mysterious world aesthetic that Breath of the Wild has been working towards. Since most of what the player does in the game is move through the open world, the narrative needs to motivate and contextualize traversal. The game story turns moving around in the game world into traveling around a devastated Hyrule on an epic quest. The narratives in Zelda have always involved a straightforward hero's journey-like structure, but this has never been too much of a problem because the simpler plot makes it easy for the player to understand why their actions matter. Why do I need to run around looking for the spiritual stones? To get to the Temple of Time and stop Ganondorf? Why do I need to obsessively stalk the inhabitants of Termina? So that I can get everything done before the moon kills everybody? Why do I need to walk through frozen wastelands, climb up more mountains than I can count, and compulsively pick food up off the ground, so that I can gather the divine beasts and seal Ganon away? Breath of the Wild confronts the player with a Hyrule that has been unnaturally regressed to a state of nature by Calamity Ganon. Hyrule feels strange to us because it is wild in an unnatural way and by an unnatural cause. Not only does Link not remember anything about himself or the world, he wouldn't even recognize the world if he did. This puts the player into the right headspace for appreciating Breath of the Wild's general gameplay loop. The apocalypse happened so long ago that we don't need to know a lot about what happened to understand the world we're in or its inhabitants. We just need to know that Ganon needs to be stopped so that things can get better. Combined together, the environment and narrative of Breath of the Wild try to get the player to see the world as interesting, but in a distant sort of way. Kind of like how an archaeologist might be interested in an ancient civilization, but without any of the work that actually goes into putting everything together. The ruins in the distance are interesting because they used to be something 100 years ago. I can go see them, but it's no big deal if I don't, because the king gave me the gist of what's going on. The reason I've been focusing on the setting and story up to this point is because Breath of the Wild's general gameplay loop depends on the player having an interest in what they see in the distance. This loop not only builds on the feelings evoked on the game's aesthetic and narrative, it actually reinforces that initial feeling of being a lone hero traveling through a strange world. When the player isn't in a shrine, Breath of the Wild's gameplay goes something like this. First, you see something you want to get to, and you have a sense of how you're going to get there. Then you actually start traveling towards this initial point of interest, and along the way, you deal with whatever challenges or interesting things you come across. You eventually get to whatever it was you wanted to see in the first place. Then you find a new vantage point to scope out what's around you, either by climbing a mountain or by fast traveling to a tower. At this point, the loop starts again, when you look for something new to travel to. All of the game's central mechanics, like stamina, temperature, health and food, weapon durability, the Sheikah Slate, the Sheikah Towers, and even fast travel, funnel into this loop, both as challenges and solutions to problems in traversal. Here are some examples. Temperature stops you from fully exploring very hot or very cold areas until you've met the right NPCs or got the right gear. But it also gives the player the opportunity to cheat the system, by either bringing a lot of food with them or by knowing the crafting system well enough to make the right food or elixirs to survive. Even by the end of the game, where you have armor to deal with almost any climate, the climate itself is still deadly if you don't change your gear to suit the situation. Stamina lets you climb to higher places and move more quickly, but because there's almost always a large distance between points of interest, it acts as a limit for how high you can go and how fast you can travel. The Sheikah Slate lets you fast travel and see into the distance, but aside from quest markers, points of interest are never marked on your map by default, so the slate is always pushing you to go where you haven't gone before and fill out the map. While a similar explanation can be given for all of Breath of the Wild's traversal mechanics, the point is that the game's world is always pushing back on the player, mechanically, narratively, and aesthetically. The end result is that the struggle with the world becomes the focal point of Breath of the Wild's gameplay. The player always feels like they're overcoming obstacles and surviving in harsh situations. In my opinion, this stranger in a strange land feeling is how Breath of the Wild successfully translates Zelda 1's vision into open-world game design. Essentially, engendering this feeling is why this game exists, and when it succeeds in making the player feel this way, it has lived up to its creative vision. Up to this point, I've been discussing how Breath of the Wild tries to live up to its heritage, to go back to its roots, of the exploratory wonder that Zelda 1 initially inspired in its players. Although my goal is to try to explain why I think that Breath of the Wild fails to fully detach from Ocarina's design, I think it's really important to acknowledge how the game succeeds on a basic level. It's important because the dissonance that the main quest inspired in me, and I think in other players, really stands out against the more coherent feeling overworld traversal. This manifests as a feeling that there's something off about the game's story and how it plays out and ends. Although it's often easier to describe what a game does wrong than what it does right, in this case I think the reverse is true. The problems with Breath of the Wild's story structure come so late in a playthrough, maybe 15 to 20 hours in, that it's easy to overlook them because the game has spent hours gaining the player's goodwill. If I had to describe it in one sentence though, I'd say the problem with Breath of the Wild is this. It has Zelda 1's overworld design, but Ocarina of Time's quest structure and narrative arc. This remaining connection to mainstay 3D Zelda design philosophy slowly but surely creates imperfections in the finely polished gem that is Breath of the Wild's overworld traversal. Eventually, the game's story makes traveling around the world less interesting. To get at what I mean, I want to take a look at what happens after Purah repairs the Sheikah Slate in Hateno village. Link learns that he and Zelda travel together throughout Hyrule, taking pictures, before he lost his memory. These 100-year-old pictures are saved onto his Sheikah Slate, and if Link can find the present-day spot where the picture was taken, he'll be able to recall a memory related to that picture. In principle, this is the game using Link's amnesia to contribute to the emotional stakes already laid out by the environment design, narrative, and gameplay loop. Accidentally finding one of these memory spots while doing something else feels like the world really is a ruined version of a better, bygone Hyrule. This is very immersive and satisfying. Even if the player uses Pikango, the painting Sheikah NPC, to learn where the pictures were taken, this still works out pretty well, since it basically gives the player a location to travel to, starting the gameplay loop. If a player cares to get them, the first 5 or so of these memories are highly likely to be out of order. This means that if it's their first playthrough, the story will be at least somewhat unclear. This helps to sell Link's amnesia and the fall of Hyrule, marking a high point in Breath of the Wild's mysterious world motif. In exploring this land, you come across a memory that lacks context and doesn't clearly fit with your other memories. This is intriguing. The mystery of what happened a century ago makes it that much more exciting to explore the world, gather memories, and complete the main quest, which itself involves Link regaining yet other lost memories. These main quest memories also motivate interacting with the various NPCs in the villages next to the divine beasts. The mystery makes them a source of non-mechanical, narrative information, as we try to piece together what happened to the races of Hyrule during the Calamity and how they're doing now. At first, the memory system makes us care, at least a little bit, about the little things, the environmental details and the Randys that we see populating settlements. However, the more the player gets involved with the memories, because they flesh out the mystery of Hyrule, the more likely they are to find all, or almost all of them, and gain a coherent understanding of the events prior to the Calamity. Even though Breath of the Wild's setting, story, and gameplay set up the feeling of a mysterious world together, both the memory system and the main quest will satisfy the curiosity that the game has given them. This implicit promise, an explicit reward, that the story must be emotionally and intellectually satisfying, is the part of Breath of the Wild which it inherits from Ocarina of Time. As we've mentioned, most Zelda games stick to a hero's journey or save the world kind of story, and for good reason. But Ocarina pioneered a more cinematic feel to these story beats. Remember meeting Saria before you leave Kokiri Forest, or the changes in Lon Lon Ranch before and after the 7-year time skip. These come from a commitment to the player's emotional attachment to these characters. The work that Ocarina puts into getting us to care about its characters is made more effective by the game's linear structure, since the developers know, for example, that you won't run off to Lake Hylia or the Gerudo Desert before meeting up with Zelda at the beginning of the game. They can design things in such a way that the tone and plot of the game will remain consistent between players. The first 3 days of Majora's Mask, before you get the Ocarina, are another great example of using linear progression to present the player with a coherent tone. This narrative structure, with its clear beginnings, consistent tone, and satisfying narrative conclusion, is part of Ocarina's ongoing legacy. What this means is that any of Breath of the Wild's players who care about the story will eventually know most of it, and the more they care about the story, the sooner they'll have a really good idea of what went on before the Calamity. But once we know what happened before the Calamity, then the game's world and aesthetic lose their vigorous intrigue, because there's no mystery to motivate us. Remember that, from its earliest moments, Breath of the Wild wants the players to feel interested in Hyrule as a distant, mysterious object. Once this interest is taken away, the only thing left is the familiar motivation of defeating Ganon, because Ganon is evil and we are good, and so on. I'll try to describe the effect of knowing too much about the game's story by describing my experience with the first and last dungeons that I completed. The first of the divine beasts I went for was Ruda, which is next to Zora's domain. The effects of my incomplete knowledge on my experience of Zora's domain is probably my favorite part of playing Breath of the Wild. Zoras live for a very long time, so most of them actually still recognize Link, even though neither Link nor the player knows much about them. At this point, I had maybe 3 to 4 memories, so I didn't really understand what was going on 100 years ago. As I entered Zora's domain, I found out that there are a lot of Zoras that just really hate Link, because they blame them for killing their warrior princess Mipha. This sets the stage for an emotional arc that only works if the player doesn't know everything that happens 100 years ago. Link and I are being blamed for the death of someone neither of us know about, and it's hindering the quest progression. Suddenly being responsible for something I never did and didn't fully understand is something that a Zelda game had never really made me feel before. I was asking questions like, did Link get Mipha killed? Could Link redeem himself for his past misdeeds? And what did Mipha think of Link while she was still alive? It was the uncertainty about Link's status and how he could atone for his deeds that made this part of the main quest interesting. Unfortunately, Breath of the Wild never made use of the creative potential of my ignorance. Before I even had the chance to properly appreciate what was going on, I was learning that Mipha loves Link, that her brother forgives Link, and I then watched her and Link have a heart-to-heart and a memory. Afterwards, things were completely ruined when I finished Ruta's dungeon and Link met Mipha's spirit. At this point, the past events are no longer in the past. They were put right in my face, and I had no more questions to ask. What lingering feelings of being potentially responsible for Mipha's death that I might have explored were totally drained of importance as Mipha forgives Link and the Zoras celebrate the taming of Ruta. Although this new state of affairs is supposed to be a reward for completing the dungeon, it felt like I lost everything that initially gotten me to care about Zora's domain. This tonal bait and switch, from somber, confusing, and resentful interactions with the Zora to complete redemption and elation, doesn't only betray the feelings I initially had when I came to Zora's domain. As we've seen in talking about how Breath of the Wild sets up its traversal, this story arc also undermines one of the two central motivations I, as a player, had for coming to Zora's domain and talking to the Zora in the first place. One being to stop Ganon or complete the main quest, and the other being to learn about the world. After taming Ruta, there's nothing to learn or think about in this part of Hyrule. This isn't to say that I should never have learned about Mipha, or what happened 100 years ago, or even that the Zora should never have forgiven Link. Rather, these rewards should have been delivered in a way that was consistent with Breath of the Wild's original mysterious world aesthetic. They should have made the world more interesting, not less. The game should have continued to highlight that Hyrule is a post-apocalyptic, mysterious place, not make me feel like the characters and Link were somehow pretending that the apocalypse never happened because Ruta was tamed. By the time I reached the final dungeon, Rudunia and the Goron City, I felt like I already knew everything there was to know about Derek, the Goron champion and Rudunia's pilot. This made me feel really distant from his grandson, Yunobo, as he was learning stuff about Derek that I either already knew or could have guessed before I even set foot into the city. Although these moments with Yunobo were still enjoyable, by this point, it just felt like I could only look down on him as someone who was ignorant of what was going on. Unlike the first few memories, the memory of Derek didn't feel like an uncovered piece of a lost past. Instead, it felt like an item off a checklist, something I knew I would get whose contents were unsurprising. By this point, the memories of the events leading up to the calamity had overtaken my actual quest as the central story of the game. I might be getting the divine beasts to stop Ganon 100 years later, but this quest is really just the tail end of a story I learn about through cutscenes. As a result of this narrative structure, the story becomes detached from the exploration towards the end of Breath of the Wild's main quest. After the third divine beast, the only reason not to go to either the fourth one or Hyrule Castle is because you want to explore. This is in stark contrast to how things were after the Isolated Plateau. Remember that, at that point, you didn't have to choose between the story and the exploration. They were one and the same. The story was about Link exploring a post-apocalyptic Hyrule, so there was no decision that needed to be made by the player. Eventually, the story becomes about Link finally defeating Ganon, atoning for everyone's deaths, and bringing Zelda's character development to a close. And this only exists in cutscenes, by the way. A player can enjoy the exploration anyway. You can try to collect all of the Korok seeds, finish all of the shrines, and eventually feel a great sense of accomplishment of the 100% completion rate before heading off to face Ganon. But the exploration has changed by this point, and not in a good way. Obviously, the mechanics themselves haven't changed all that much, but the narrative context in which they were placed has changed. Breath of the Wild transitions from completely encouraging the player's engagement with traversal to encouraging the player to finish the main quest. Especially on a first playthrough, exploring Hyrule after finishing all of the dungeons feels like an aside, because you're supposed to be fighting Ganon. Of course, exploration will change as the player becomes more familiar with the mechanics and as they accumulate resources and items to make traversal easier and more straightforward. Think Revolvi's Gale. The difference between these kinds of changes and the changes that the main quest brings about is that one is a development of the game's original vision, and one is an abrupt change in how the gameplay relates to the story. The Stranger in a Strange Land motif, or Link versus the Wilderness feeling, should be different by the time the player has mastered the game. This is both unavoidable and a good thing. The player should always feel like the game has changed when they've gotten better at it. But that this same feeling should go from being Breath of the Wild's main focus to taking a backseat to the narrative is both avoidable and detrimental. It is avoidable by changing the plot and narrative structure of the game, and it is detrimental because it undermines the original reasons the player had for being engaged with the world. I should stress at this point that I'm not saying that Breath of the Wild starts out as a good game and becomes a bad game toward the end. Even with everything I've said, the game is still fun the whole way through. I feel more comfortable saying that Breath of the Wild starts out as a kind of masterclass in how to make your aesthetic, narrative, and gameplay line up with each other, but it ends as a pretty good open-world game. And by pretty good, I mean better than most. There are a lot of ways to totally butcher an open-world game, so saying that the tail end of Breath of the Wild is bad is probably wrong. But just because a game is competent doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to learn from its mistakes. I'm excited to see how the next Zelda game tries to improve on Breath of the Wild's design. I think that these issues we've talked about are signs that Breath of the Wild represents a transition in Zelda's game design, an attempt to improve Zelda games in a way in which they've never been improved on before. These are basically growing pains, and when the base game is as good as Breath of the Wild, that's a very impressive place to start charting a new course from. I hope you've enjoyed your time with me on Keeping It Sharp. Until next time, later days.